Hello and welcome to my final project presentation for applied data analysis. My name is Cole Bryant and the title of my project is Predicting Human Activity Using Wearable Sensor Data. So for some background, my project is related to a subfield in data science called human activity recognition. And human activity recognition is concerned with predicting the activity of the human body given sensor input data. And so this field has become more relevant in recent years due to the growth of wearables such as smartwatches and fitness bands. And there are many applications for predicting physical activity, especially in healthcare, but in other realms as well, and of course in fitness tracking. So the overall objective of my project is to solve a multi-classification problem. It's to classify sensor input data into well-defined activities. The data that I'm using for my project is called the MHEALTH dataset, which is sourced from the UCI machine learning repository. The data was produced from a study in which 10 volunteers performed 12 specific activities while wearing 3 different sensors on their body, one on their chest, one on their right wrist, and one on their left ankle. So some of the examples of the attributes of this data set are acceleration data, gyroscope data, and magnetometer data. And as you can see, the data has an axis associated with it, X, Y, or Z, so it's triaxial data, spatial data essentially. And so again, there are specifically 12 different classes for this problem, in addition to a null class. So for solving, of course, originally to read up on existing literature in human activity recognition and common techniques that are used, to perform exploratory data analysis and produce visualizations, then to pre-process and prepare the data for analysis. I knew that I wanted to utilize a range of classification models for this problem, as well as to tune them to try to get the best accuracy score. I performed cross-validation for my models, for essentially all of them using 5-fold cross-validation. I set out to evaluate the results of my classifications using common classification metrics that I saw, namely accuracy, but also precision and recall and others. And then of course, to present it in a confusion matrix, which I often saw in the literature that I read. And then perform any readjustment necessary on my approach to try to get the best accuracy. The goal I set for myself in terms of accuracy was to get better than 90%. And the stretch goal that I set for myself for this project was to utilize a new tool, as well as implement a more advanced model to solve this problem. So for the exploratory data analysis stage, one thing that became evident to me was that the MHEALTH data set was already in a really good condition. So that saved me a lot of time in terms of not needing to clean the data. And I immediately noticed, of course, that the data was sequential, but it did not have timestamps. Instead, it was sampled at a rate of 50 Hertz. The data was, however, very imbalanced in terms of the activity classes. So the null activity class had far too many observations. So essentially, I understand that it in the experiment, it was probably noise. It was likely before or after these activities were performed. And so I knew that I needed to rebalance the data. And finally, I created several visualizations of the features, all 3 axes for each. And it became clear that I could see some patterns, as you can see below in this visualization. So for the data pre-processing stage, again, I knew I needed to rebalance the data, but more so than that, on my initial modeling, I found that especially with the more complex models, with the size of my data set being over 1 million observations, it was difficult to have good run times. And so I chose to resample the data set in terms of 3,000 observations for each activity category. And I was able to verify that this would be acceptable for the analysis by charting the distributions of the resampled data set versus the full data set, which closely matched each other. As you can see below, this is an example. And across the board, the distributions looked very much the same. And so I deemed it acceptable. I standardized the predictors for better performance on my models, split the data between test and train sets. And then for the convolutional neural network, I'll get into later, I had to do some additional pre-processing. So the first set of models that I utilized for my analysis were logistic regression and k-nearest neighbors, models that are a little bit more straightforward in my mind, and additionally, I feel a little bit more comfortable and familiar with. So for logistic regression, I utilized the 2 different solvers in these models and was able to achieve a cross-validated accuracy of approximately 62%. You can see on the right the confusion matrix for one of these models. This was not particularly good, I felt, and so I decided it would be better to move on to other types of models to solve this problem. So I did not spend much time in tuning logistic regression. For k-nearest neighbors, however, I was able to achieve very good results, I felt, with k equals 5, an accuracy of approximately 93% cross-validated, and k equals 3, approximately 94% cross-validated. So off the bat, this was a very good model for this data set, and the accuracy score was already above the threshold that I was trying to meet. So additionally, in my project, I knew that I wanted to utilize models that were used in the literature that I read, that were proven to be good for the problem of human activity recognition, namely support vector machine classifiers and random forest classifiers. And so for these models, I spent more time on them. I spent more time hypertuning the parameters to try and get the best accuracy scores. So for the support vector machine classifier, I tuned the kernel choice regularization parameter and gamma parameters and was able to achieve a cross-validated accuracy of about 95.5%, which is pretty good. And then for the random forest classifier, which is an ensemble method, I tuned the number of estimators, the max depth, entropy criterion, minimum samples required, leaf and split, and was able to achieve cross-validated accuracy of approximately 96%. So these models, again, both performed very well on the data set. So after using these models to perform classifications, I decided I wanted to go after the stretch goal that I set for myself. And so I decided to, in a lot of the literature that I read, the best performing models I noticed were, especially in the more recent papers, were convolutional neural networks. And so these neural networks are commonly used for image recognition problems, but again, have been shown to be effective for HAR. And so in order to create a CNN model for this problem, I used TensorFlow and Keras libraries. And I used that within the Google Colab GPU environment in order to have better run times. This involved a lot of research on my part, and especially in terms of how to construct the structure of the CNN. And so I was able to find some good recommendations for this particular problem domain. So I transformed the input data into samples, essentially arrays that represent windows of time. And I just used 25 time steps for each array. And then in terms of the structure of the CNN on a high level, the first, the first two layers are 1D CNN layers, which are essentially used for learning features from those input data samples, followed by a dropout layer, which is essentially a layer to ease the learning rate of the overall CNN. Next, a pooling layer, which reduces the learning feature sizes to just the most essential elements. And then the learned features are flattened to essentially a long vector, which is passed to a fully connected dense layer. And the idea is that this dense layer then interprets the features, the learned features, before the prediction is finally made, and the classifications are made at the output layer. So the initial accuracy I achieved with my CNN was cross-validated was 91%. However, I was able to achieve, as far as I can tell, a 99% accuracy with the CNN, and I'll get into on the next slide how I was able to do this, and also my potential reservations as if this is actually an accurate result. So again, a number of challenges that I had with the CNN. It's a more complex structure than a multi-level perceptron, so I needed to kind of at least learn on a high level how it functions. Require new libraries. The computationally expensive part, again, I don't have a GPU, and it sort of takes a long time to run these models on my resources, and so, but I was able to use Google Colab to help with that. Again, I needed to transform the input data to time series samples. And so the problem that I was alluding to earlier was that created this discrepancy between the results of my initial CNN and my final CNN. It ended up being that I shuffled the data, or rather that the data was shuffled on the initial test, train test split for the first CNN prior to having changed that input data into time series samples. And so essentially, like the sequential nature of the data was lost before I was able to chunk them into these time series samples. And so, but after I realized that, and then I was able to shuffle the already bucketed data samples for the purpose of training the model, that was what led to it essentially kept the sequential nature of the data. And so that is why I believe there was such a huge jump in performance in my CNN. Again, with such a high accuracy score, it's difficult for me to know if I did something wrong, but the data, there was a lot of data sourced for this problem, 3 different sensors on the volunteers' bodies, and so I think it's maybe possible that I was able to do this, but it is a new model for me, so it's something that I want to learn more about. So conclusions and lessons learned from my project in no particular order. I could see that there are a number of different classification models that work well for this task. Of course, for me, the convolutional neural network performed best, assuming that it was a valid convolutional neural network, followed by Random Forest and the support vector machine classifier. I think one of the biggest lessons learned for me that I was stuck on is what I was discussing earlier, the data shuffling problem in regards to sequential data, and how that was causing some discrepancies in my model performances. Additionally, one observation that I made was that the models were not performing well in the null activity class, which is understandable given that there's likely no rhyme or reason to these sensor input data in the null activity class. And then just overall, the fact that I had good, easy to work with data made this process a lot easier for me. And so and then also research into the existing literature is very helpful in finding good working models. General considerations for future work. It would make sense, again, given my hesitancy on my great performance with CNN to further validate the CNN. One thing that I did not spend much time on was feature engineering and hand-picking features. For some models, this could be beneficial. But one thing that hindered me from doing this was not having a lot of domain knowledge. Also, hypertuning. I was initially tried to use algorithms such as grid search, but they were computationally expensive, and so I just did it one by one. But I think it would be good to use those types of algorithms. And then finally, or additionally, applying more strategies that have been proven effective for time series data. I'm not very familiar with dealing with time series data, but I understand that adding lag1 and lag2 values as training parameters could be beneficial to try to essentially extract more features. And then another consideration that I thought of would be to bucket a singular subject's data all into either the test set or the train set. I think this would better emulate using this type of model in the real world on, like, for example, a completely new person's sensor data. And in addition, on that note, with like real world, would be to try to obtain a high accuracy score using only just a single sensor's data. Again, my project, I was able to, the data was sourced from individuals wearing 3 different sensors, and in all likelihood, in reality, people aren't going to be wearing 3 different sensors. So it would be interesting to try to solve this problem with just one sensor's input data. And that does it for my presentation. Thank you for listening.